On today's show, it is now officially July. Free agency is underway. The Hawks have been quiet for a few days, and we'll talk about why that might be and much more on today's podcast. And all of that is coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1755 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening. It's July 1st, going into July 2nd, and today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for absolutely everyone, every day, all summer long at FanDuel, and the place to go is FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I also want to encourage you, as I always do at the top of the podcast, make us your first listen here at Locked On Hawks each and every day. Check us out on all podcast platforms, including Apple and Spotify and Overcast. Ratings and reviews also appreciated there. If you're watching this podcast on YouTube, thanks for being here. Go ahead and click the like button on this episode, and also please subscribe to the show on that platform. It's been a little bit quiet in Hawks land in the last couple of days. It's the absolute bonanza at the end of last week. Again, it's July 1st. I'm recording this. So it'll be July 2nd. You're probably listening to this on Tuesday. I covered the intro press conference for Zachary Shai, number one overall pick, of course, and Nikola Jurisic as well on Friday morning. That includes some interesting comments from Landry Fields, the Hawks general manager. And then a few hours later, the Hawks had a bit of a blockbuster trade, sending Dejounte Murray to New Orleans, which prompted an emergency podcast, as you might expect, on Friday night, and then a follow-up podcast on a Saturday. Then NBA free agency opened in earnest on Sunday evening. And as I speak to you on Monday evening here in Atlanta, at the beginning of July, the Hawks have not made another move since the Murray trade happened. So obviously we'll talk about kind of how quiet it's been, why that might be, where things stand now. Plus, at the very end of today's show, we'll talk about some names in free agency to keep in mind. Again, this is rapidly updating. So I'm going to try to timestamp almost every episode in the month of July for a while because there's just a lot going on. I'm recording this podcast at like 10 or 10:30 p.m. Eastern time on Monday, July 1st. So things might change fast, and just keep that in mind when listening to the podcast. But we'll start here with a bit of an update on the Dejounte Murray trade saga. So I could do a very long explainer on this that would be very wonky and kind of in the weeds CBA-wise. I'm not going to do that for you today, but the Murray deal has still not yet been announced/finalized. Not a surprise, I will say. There was a pathway for the deal to be done in the old league year, which actually ended on Sunday, but that didn't happen. And now the short version is the deal was going to happen now in the new league year, and that cannot actually be announced and finalized until at least July 6th when the moratorium ends. That also means that Murray counts for more money because he got the extension with a reasonable raise, and there's some uncertainty for New Orleans on how it's all going to fold in due to Dejounte's trade kicker, which bumps about 15% from his previous salary. So Sunday night, Jake Fisher of Yahoo reported this and basically said the following, quote, the decision on how much of Murray's 50% trade kicker he'll receive has been left open-ended to provide greater flexibility as the Pelicans proceed with their offseason, end quote. So what that number is actually going to look like is going to dictate what the Pelicans have to do to salary match and all that fun stuff on the backside. There's been some buzz. They're trying to expand the deal maybe to other teams, make it a little bit easier on themselves. This is not going to include the Hawks. Well, I guess it could, but this is the Pelicans' kind of responsibility / effort to kind of make this all work. It's already been agreed to by the Hawks and Pelicans, etc. So they're trying to look to do other stuff and fold it all in. This happens a lot. This is not out of the ordinary at all. For a low-profile recent example, the trade that sent AJ Griffin to Houston became a 3-team deal, even if it wasn't a 3-team deal originally. So originally it was a 2-team deal with the Hawks and the Rockets, and within a few hours it expanded to a 3-team deal, although the Hawks portion of the trade didn't change at all. That is going to be probably a similar case to what happened with this Dejounte trade. It is a 2-team deal right now with the Hawks and the Pelicans. It's been agreed to. The whole world knows this. It's been confirmed by team people, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, it's not official. And something that ESPN's Bobby Marks talked about a little bit on Sunday and Monday, the Pelicans have had guys that were on their team last year leave in free agency or agree to deals in free agency, let's just say. As 2 examples, Jonas Valanciunas in Washington and Najee Marshall in Dallas. Those could be mechanisms of being like a sign and trade there just to have something to create and have all the teams touch. And again, I'm going to go a little bit shorter here on the CBA side, but The deal's probably going to expand a little bit around the core trade just for money reasons. That does not mean that the Hawks are changing the trade on their side. They could. I'm not ruling that out, but it's just NBA style kind of money laundering. Basically, it's going to happen there. So no panic. Don't worry. And it's normal that this has not happened yet. And honestly, at this point, once it was not announced on Sunday, it cannot be announced by the teams until at least July 6th. That's just the nature of the beast and the moratorium in the NBA. I know it's a little bit weird, but that's the nature of the beast. Okay. More news or updates, I should say, to Saturday. So I reported on Saturday on the podcast that the Hawks and Bruno Fernando had mutually agreed to push back their guarantee on Bruno's contract to July. But the Hawks had not communicated what date that was going to be yet, something that both myself and Lauren Williams, the AJC, reported on Saturday. Since then, I reported that it's actually going to be July 10th. So that's how the date to circle for Bruno. That's 9 days away as I'm recording this podcast. I mentioned this on the show on Saturday as well. This is the exact same date they used last year when they agreed to push back Bruno's guarantee and ended up keeping him at the end of that. So they could still keep him. They could not keep him. That is definitely up for debate right now. A lot of it, I think, is tied to what happens with the trio of Capella, Okongwu, and Larry Nance. It is a lot easier and more practical to keep Bruno if they move one of the other three guys. If they don't do that, they can still keep Bruno as a fourth center, but just the utility of that's a little bit strange. If you move Nance or Okongwu or Capella and don't get another center back, you kind of slot Bruno in as that very cheap, team-friendly, everybody likes guy third center that makes a lot of sense. So that's the nature there. We will see on that front. There are other things that are obviously happening in the meantime. They're negotiating with their free agents. They're talking to other free agents. But Bruno's date went from the 29th to July 10th, and that is the new date to circle there. And by the way, the Hawks will already have been, at least some of the team will already be in Vegas, and kind of the most of the business, I would imagine, is usually done by then. So we'll probably get some more information on that in the coming days. But his final guarantee date for his contract is July 10th. And but basically what that means is if the Hawks want to keep Bruno, they do nothing. He just stays on the roster, and he becomes guaranteed. They pay him. If they don't want to keep him on the roster, they have to actively waive him or trade him, but actively waive him by that date, or he becomes guaranteed for the rest of the season. All right, we'll have more coming up. I actually got a question about Jalen Johnson we'll get to in a second. Some money stuff around the Hawks. And at the end of the podcast, again, some free agent talk and some names to keep in mind or at least monitor on some level in the coming days. But first, a word from our partners on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, and summertime means baseball, basketball, and much more. You can bet it all at FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Bet on all of your favorite players and teams with quick bets and live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and much more. And the FanDuel Sportsbook app is really easy to use. They have all stuff you're looking for across the sports betting space, from over-unders to point spreads, money lines, player props, future bets, and much more. The app is safe. It's secure. They cover the entire range of sporting offerings as well. That includes the NBA, the WNBA, NFL, college football, MLB, golf, tennis, soccer. The Euros are big right now, for instance. Auto racing, boxing, MMA, and much more. And now is an awesome time to sign up with the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. And the place to go is FanDuel.com/lockedon. One more time, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, this is not a mailbag show, but I have a question that I wanted to answer that was kind of topical right now on this July 1st day that I'm recording this podcast. It comes from Will, who says, what is the latest on Jalen Johnson's extension? Can he sign it whenever? Good question here, Will. It has not been top of mind, I will say, in Hawksland because of the draft and #1 overall pick, then the Murray trade and free agency. But the draft class of 2021, of which Jalen was a first-round pick in that class, is now rookie extension eligible as of July 1st, and that includes Jalen. So as a refresher, he'd be signing an extension if he does so. That would not start for another year from now. Recent guys of Hawks benches that sign extensions, Kevin Huerter, DeAndre Hunter, Onyeka Okongwu, Trae Young, all those guys signed a year early and they signed this extension window. Some guys did not, though. John Collins waited, Saddiq Bey waited, etc. It's not a always, nor is it a never. It's kind of it's case by case, we'll say, across the board. But he's already locked into his salary for this year, but Jalen could sign for anything up to 5 years at the max, which he won't get, but that's what he can sign for right now as far as an extension is concerned, starting on July 1st. So only a couple of those have gotten done so far. It's Scotty Barnes got done, and it seems like Kate Cunningham was close to getting done in Detroit. I always say this, but in general, the majority, not all, but the majority of rookie extensions either happen in the first couple of days of July or the last couple of days in October before the extension deadline occurs. Once you get past the deadline in October, you can't extend. Now, Jaylen would still be a restricted free agent, so it's not like a huge deal, but that's notable there. And also, of course, there are some exceptions because that trend happens to be true. Occasionally, a guy will sign at the end of July or out of nowhere in September or whatever. But usually, it's early or late for the most part. And by the way, the guys that get done early are usually the max extension guys. Like Trae Young signed the first day. That was natural. It was always going to be the max at that point in time, etc. Jaylen's not going to get the same amount of money as Cade or Barnes, but if an extension happens, it's going to be for a lot of money. I feel confident in saying that to you. I answered a question back, I think in June, maybe even May, about Jaylen's extension on the podcast. I can't remember where, but one of the mainstream sites had projections for these, and someone wrote 5 years and 125 for Jaylen Johnson. And I can tell you with some pretty good authority from what I have heard that I would be flat out shocked if Jaylen signed for that little. I know it's a lot of money, obviously, but that's $25 million a year. And in the new cap environment, that's not enough for what Jaylen has already proven to be. I think it's going to be considerably more than that. And also, if you look at 1 year ago, Devin Vassell, Jaden McDaniels, guys who I'd say are at least comparable, probably not necessarily ahead of Jaylen, they got like 5 for in the 130-ish range. And that's in a lower cap environment a year earlier. So you would imagine Jaylen's going to get more than that, or he just won't sign it. This is not a rookie extension, but so it's not apples to apples. But I'm sure Jaylen's reps were not upset to see someone like Emmanuel Quickley get 5 years and 175 in free agency a few days ago. Different positions, but you could certainly argue that Jaylen and Quickley are not super different players, and so he got $35 million a year. That's a lot of money. That was probably a little bit much for Quickley, but still, I'm sure that was a positive data point if you are on the agent or the player side. So yeah, there's that. I don't have a prediction right now as to whether it's going to get done or not. It's not all weird at all that it's not happened so far. Again, it's still very early. It is July 1st. I'm recording this podcast. It may not happen until October or never. And as a reminder of kind of my own philosophy here, if I am the team side, I would not be giving out an extension unless I thought it was really team friendly, or at least decently team friendly. Like the most recent example of a deal that I didn't like for the Hawks was DeAndre Hunter a year early, because basically the feeling in the league, and I agree with this, was that it was like, why are they doing this now? Like they didn't get a discount. If you're going to do a deal ahead of time, it should be for discount. For instance, Kevin Huerter signed a year ahead. That was a team-friendly deal. Okongwu signed a year ahead. That was a team-friendly deal. That's when you want to do those extensions if you're the team. If you are paying full freight or more, you just wait. So, yes, there's risk with Jaylen that he just has an awesome, awesome season and he becomes a max player. But look, that wouldn't be great for your books. But if he blows up into a max player, you're okay. You feel great about that. You pay him. You move on. There's no way he can get away, by the way. He's going to be restricted. So unless you want to let him go, he won't be able to let him go. So it is what it is, but I would be cautious. But if the Hawks pay him a lot of money, you shouldn't be surprised. His market's going to be a lot of money. It's going to be a 9-figure deal for a long time, and he's going to be very exciting. And I've said this before already this summer, but a lot of the discussions around the league and including around the Hawks are basically like Jaylen is the guy who's untouchable on the roster, along with, I would say, Ricochet now. Even more so than Trae. Obviously, Trae is better than Jaylen right now, but as far as the Hawks are concerned, Jalen's like the most untouchable guy on their roster, and they're going to act accordingly, I think. So we'll see. But he is eligible as of now. He has not agreed to a deal. I know they're talking, but I don't know how close they are. We will see in the coming days. All right, shifting gears to some more money stuff. The league announced its cap guidance for the upcoming season. The final numbers, basically. This is actually kind of a funny sidebar. The Hawks will receive almost $12 million in just cash. This is it. This is to their owners, to Wrestler, etc. Or simply being under the tax a year ago. So the way this works is if you are over the tax line, you pay into the balance. And teams like Golden State and LA paid a lot of money, and that led to a large amount. If you're below the tax, even by $1, you get a payment received. And that's part of the reason why teams like to stay under the tax, i.e. the Hawks. So it's not just about avoiding tax payments. You also get money back. So alas, I made the point many times, the tax avoidance has kind of hurt the Hawks, making it harder to be sort of building a winning basketball team. But I digress. That happened. Now, looking forward, The final numbers for the cap for this year are close to projections, but they're not exactly the same. Just roughly, the cap's like 140.6 or so. That's, I'm rounding there on purpose. The tax line's about 170.7. First apron's above that, et cetera, et cetera. Next year, so the following year, this 25-26 season, it's actually going to be the first of what is projected to be a bunch of big jumps in a row. So there's the new TV deal. Starting next summer, it's going to be probably going up 10% each year for a while. And that means because they kind of smoothed it out. Famously in 2016, they didn't smooth it out. It was one giant cap jump that threw the whole league into chaos. This time around, they agreed to kind of not do that. So 10% is a big jump too. The cap's going to be about 14 million higher next year, at least it's projected to be right now, than it is this year. And the tax will be 17 million higher than it is this year. I'm going to hold off on this as a real topic until later, but just as a quick note here, the Hawks could, if they really wanted to, create meaningful cap space next summer, which they haven't had cap space in a long time. They've been over the cap for a while. Cap space and tax space are different, but if they don't extend Jaylen, that's the big thing. If they extend Jaylen, there's not really a way to do it. But if they end up not extending Jaylen, he has a pretty modest cap hold. And if they were to get off of, let's say, DeAndre Hunter for cheap, Capella's going to be expiring. They could create, like, I don't know, 30 million in space, something like that, if they wanted to, fairly easily. I won't go down the rabbit hole right now as of how they would do that. But if they wanted to take a big swing at free agency a year from now, they could structure their books to do that. Now, that's not always advisable. Like, for instance, if Jaylen wants to sign a friendly extension, go ahead and do that, I would say. But this year, for instance, the example of that is Philly, where Philly purposely kept their books very clean. They didn't extend Tyrese Maxey. Now, I'm sure they talked to him and said, look, Tyrese, we're going to pay you your max basically as soon as we can. But he had just like Jaylen would, Maxey had a very low cap hold, which allowed them to have extra room free agency. Of course, that led to Paul George. Now, you can't bank on Paul George coming or whoever that player is going to be. It's obviously a risk. But if the Hawks wanted to do that, they probably could. That's a long way away. Anyway, the mid-level is something to circle this year. I did a little bit of a preview of this in the last couple of days, but the mid-level and the biannual exception are like what the Hawks might be able to use to add to the team for this year. I'll say this. The mid-level is coming in at about $12.8 million in year one or less. You can actually use part of it if you want to. I think the only way the Hawks will use the MLE this year is if they also trade someone else on their roster to chop some money down. Notice I said I think and not I know. But the reason why I'm saying this, and I'm not going to do the whole tax rundown on today's show, but if the Hawks, the Hawks don't have a lot of wiggle room right now under the tax. Now, they're solidly under the tax after the Dejounte trade and the Griffin trade. Those save money. That was, I'm sure, part of the calculus. You can debate amongst yourselves how much of that was the reason why. And by the way, I like the Murray trade, just saying that out loud. They're about $5-ish million under the tax right now if you project Bruno to be on the team. But that's without Vit Krejci coming for a single cent, and Saddiq Bey, who they still could bring back, also $0 of that. I will be quite surprised if the Hawks add a mid-level player and go over the tax to do it. I can't imagine that happening. I'd be pretty surprised. Again, I wouldn't say it's 0% chance, but no one, and I mean no one in the league that I've talked to believes the Hawks are going to pay the tax. No one. So if they do want to use the MLE, and by the way, the pickings are getting slimmer and slimmer by the hour because that's just the nature of the beast in free agency. But if they want to do that, they probably need, in this case, I'm using giant quotation marks if you're not watching the podcast on YouTube, trim some salary elsewhere, either with trading Capella or trading Nance or trading Hunter. Different ways to do that. But yeah, keep an eye on that. But we'll see. After a quick break, from our partners, I will talk about some actual names in free agency. And look, I'm not reporting any of these names as guys that the Hawks are going to sign, just trying to cast a wide net on this. But first, a word from our partners on the podcast today. All right, and before we get out of here, a little bit of a listing or at least a reference guide of some players that are still available. Again, I'm recording this podcast at like 10:30 on Monday night. For instance, a guy that was on my list, Mo Bamba, just agreed to a deal with the Clippers. This is all happening in real time, and there's a reason why I'm time-stamping these episodes this time of year. For the record, I'm not going to list anyone that is likely to get more than the mid-level exception. A lot of the sexy names are already gone anyway, like your Paul Georges, as I referenced earlier, but if you want more info, I did talk about the exceptions on the podcast on Saturday. the Hawks do not have cap space. So they could never really reasonably get in on Paul George unless it was a weird sign and trade. Klay Thompson, same thing, et cetera, et cetera. And I will do one more reminder, though. The Hawks can use their exceptions to trade for players. So the mid-level used to be only a signing. Now you can trade for a guy that fits in the mid-level. That might be an option at some point, maybe. I won't list candidates there because it's really hard to do trades and fake trades, but keep that in mind as a potential. So I'm gonna go by position here. And again, these guys might be gone by the time you listen to this podcast tomorrow. That's just what happens now. But by the way, these are also not in order of any kind. Of course, I was going to lead with old pal Delon Wright, who I love. He was high on my list, but he signed in Milwaukee today. So I wish Delon the best always, but there you go. There are some defense-first guards like Markelle Fultz or Kyle Lowry or Dennis Smith Jr. I had Chris Dunn on the list. He signed today as well. That would have been more interesting to me before they traded for Dyson Daniels. I think still I would monitor those guys, but not something that's like as big of a need given the presence of Bufkin and Daniels. There are some pure backup point guards that I think might be interesting for the Hawks. I think Tyus Jones is like out of their price range because he's just like too good for the role the Hawks would have. But obviously, if you want to call him, that's fine. Monty Morris, a favorite of mine. Cam Payne is like more of a scorer, but is definitely a point guard. Jordan McLaughlin is like a boring third point guard, but not too bad. I was going to bring up Colin Gillespie, actually. There was some buzz about him over the weekend in the Hawks, but he actually agreed to a deal with Phoenix today, so I crossed him off the list as kind of that backup point guard type. I wouldn't fall on the floor if they signed Trent Forrest to return. I haven't heard that, but obviously they like Trent Forrest. I also like Shake Milton more than most. Just want to say that out there. He's more of a two, but still. And look, I'm not saying that they have to sign someone over Kobe Bufkin. I like Kobe Bufkin a lot, and right now he's the backup point guard. What I will say is I'll be a little surprised if they don't bring in a third point guard of some kind on the roster, whether it's on a two-way deal or a backup point guard minimum contract kind of thing. Because, look, if something happens to Trey or Kobe, but especially to Trey right now on their current roster, it would be a lot of Kobe, but you have to have a backup too. Like you need 3 point guards on the roster. And yes, maybe Dyson Daniels can do that a little bit. Dyson did play some point guard in New Orleans, but I would like to have, if I'm the Hawks, someone else that's more of a traditional or a like more established point guard type. Even if it's like a deep bench guy like McLaughlin or something like that, I think that's probably something they should at least think about doing either on a two-way or a full deal. All right, to the wings and forwards. And by the way, this goes without saying, but if they keep Saddiq Bey, it's a little bit harder to see them signing a guy from the outside. Also, Vit, I'm operating as if they're going to keep Vit. Keep that in mind too. A bunch of these guys that I liked are gone. Headlined by my wing crush in Najee Marshall, who signed with who agreed to a deal with the Mavs. But still some guys around. I think Caleb Martin is probably out of their range, but certainly a guy I would call. Simone Fontecchio is a guy who's restricted, but I think he's good and he can shoot, so I would call him. Haywood Highsmith, a good defender. I think Luke Kennard and Malik Beasley are both like undervalued in my mind, but they're both like shooter types, offense only types, which make less sense with Bogey. So if you were to, and by the way, I'm not recommending this because I think Bogey's underrated and awesome. If they were to move on from Bogey, they become interesting, but if not, then it doesn't really make sense. There are some lower tier guys too. Again, these are not sexy names, but Gordon Hayward, who didn't work at all in OKC, but might be a super buy low candidate. Old pal Torian Prince is not great, but he can shoot at 6'8". Daniel House played for Quinn for a while in Utah. Gwinnett County's own Josh Okogie for another defensive player. They wanted to add another guy there. Chetty Osman, Kessler Edwards, O'Shea Brissett, I like. BJ Boston, a couple of like bomber shooter types. Davis Bertans, Doug McDermott, like not good defenders, but certainly guys that can shoot it if you want to have that archetype on your roster. Jordan Nwora, kind of the same thing, more of a shooter. Maybe Chuma Okeke, flyer. He's a local Atlanta product who was a first-round pick of the Magic. Still a talented guy. Jay Crowder is probably near the end of his career, but he's been tied to Atlanta before. He's from the area. He's kind of washed, but not in a way that's like unplayable necessarily. I like Precious Achiuwa maybe a little bit more than some in some roles, but probably a little less than some. He can defend. There's something there. And then Dom Barlow is a guy that I think is underrated from San Antonio. Just a very low-cost probable player, but someone I think is pretty talented. They also could probably use a stretch big if they could find one. There are not a lot of names available in this vein. Like Kevin Love got signed already, for instance, as did Jalen Smith. But I would call Gallo. Like Gallo's old, but he does what Gallo does. He can shoot it. Same with Mike Muscala, ironically, an old friend there. Who else? This is not a stretch guy, but Xavier Tillman is like a backup center. Obviously, you don't need Tillman unless you trade one of the other guys at center. They don't need a center right now as constructed, but if they trade other guys, a different role, different archetype. I know that people always want 7-footers. There's always people in my mentions and comments like, sign a 7-footer. Okay, pick one. Biombo's out there. Like there's some guys, but it is a little bit deeper at this point in time. So anyway, that's a lot of names on purpose. I'm not even recommending that the Hawks sign any of those guys. I'm just listing guys who are still available, who could be interesting based on where you're looking for if you're the Hawks. So obviously, summer free agency targets. There's some trade possibilities for the Hawks still, for sure. Just as a refresher at the end of the podcast, I think Vit Krejci is still very likely to come back in some form. I get questions like every hour about Vit and why he hasn't signed yet. It is July 1st. It's still quite early. It doesn't feel like that, I know, but he's restricted. He can't get away. Everyone I talk to kind of likes Vit, but it's not like it's going to be a huge contract. They'll find a deal at some point. I think I've heard that. They're still talking. No worries there. I mentioned this a few times, but again, I still think that one of Okongwu, Capella, and Nance is going to probably be gone. Probably not definitely, but probably because it's just a lot of resources at center, and you can't play all three of them a ton. Hunter is available still in trade, just to answer that question. People keep asking me that as well. It's not that easy, though. He has 3 years left, and I've said this a lot of times, but just to repeat it a little bit here, it's a contract that's not an absolute disaster, but it's not one that teams are clamoring to get, and it's 3 more years. So it only takes one team, but I don't know who that team is right now with Hunter. So keep an eye on that. Also discussed a little bit actually on Twitter today. I mentioned it earlier on this podcast too, but I've heard that the Hawks and Saddiq Bey's people are still talking. I know Lauren Williams, the AJC, echoed the same thing after I tweeted it today. She quote tweeted me with kind of the same information. It does not mean that they're definitely going to sign Saddiq, but I think people kind of overreacted to the non-qualifying offer decision and thought like, oh, he's gone for sure. Like that's not the case. Saddiq, they have his bird rights. They can sign him if they want to. I'm not saying they're gonna, but the market may not be there for Saddiq. And if he wants a kind of soft landing spot, Quinn likes him. And yeah, he had a bad season, but Saddiq is actually still a very serviceable role player. Obviously, the injury adds a lot of complication there. But yeah, a lot going on there. But that's my rundown for the day. It's still quite quiet. I do think it's kind of funny that the Hawks made this legitimate blockbuster on Friday night, and people are still mad they haven't done anything so far. I get it. The world moves fast around basketball, but still a long way to go in this process. And really, the urgency level, I understand, like on free agents, there's more urgency because guys just get signed and they come off the board. But for trade stuff, there's a little bit less of that because it's like, okay, you can take your time to some extent, especially if you're willing to keep guys. Unless there's a guy that you're not willing to keep on your roster, it becomes a lot more of a waiting game. And there's flexibility still for this Hawks team. And yeah, they also have a full roster. Not full, but they have a more complete roster than most teams do on July 1st, and that allows you some flexibility as well. All right, that's all I have on today's podcast. I will have more later on this week. It will depend on what the Hawks do, but I'm planning to have some guests on. We'll probably do some mailbag stuff, big picture, small picture, and then we'll kind of dive back into the rookies and the young guys because Summer League is coming. The Hawks open Summer League in like a week and a half out in Vegas, so that'll be interesting. We'll focus on that quite a bit when we get there. So please subscribe to the podcast. Please go ahead and tell your friends about the show as well. If you're watching on YouTube, like this episode and subscribe. If you're listening on audio platforms, go ahead and do that there as well. Subscribe to the podcast, rate, review, all that fun stuff. Also follow the show on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there as well at BT Rowland. I also write about the Hawks on a regular basis at patreon.com/BT Rowland. Hopefully this podcast will not be spoiled too fast, but there's a reason why I'm recording it late at night. So stay tuned. Keep in mind, I'm I'm signing off now like 11 p.m. Eastern time. So keep that in mind if anything happens in the near future. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you all next time.